So I'm Professor Sarah Cook, and I'm a professor in museum studies, but I'm also one of the co-directors of the Digital Departures Lab at the University of Glasgow.
I'm Dr. Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg, and I'm an artist. And my work looks at our relationship with nature and technology, and often using technology to understand those complicated relationships that modern humans have created for ourselves.
Hi, so I'm Sarah Cook, and I'm thrilled to be here with Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg to talk about programmable nature. And Daisy, one of the reasons we invited you to talk about this is because your work is at that intersection of technology, culture, the built environment, the natural environment. So maybe we could start with you just telling us a little bit about your background, your role as an artist, and how your studio functions.
Well, I'm probably unconventional as an artist because I trained in architecture and then in design. So once upon a time, I thought I might become an architect. And I realized after my first degree that what really interested me was not so much the buildings, but how design and creating stuff and how humans create stuff can really change the way our lives are made and our effects on the built environment and the natural world. And that sounds very naive, but as a young student, it sort of started to kind of raise questions for me about the ethics of design, and that became my focus. And I ended up on a master's course at the Royal College of Art, this really unusual and exceptional department that ran for about 10 years called Design Interactions, which was led by Tony Dunn and Fiona Raby. And this course was slightly different from other design disciplines because we looked at emerging technologies, but using design in a critical way to examine the implications, the social, cultural, and ethical implications of new and emerging technologies. And I knew nothing about biotechnology or nanotechnology or AI or the kinds of things that we were beginning to look at in 2007. So it was a crash course in the future, essentially, for me. And I went on to immerse myself in a field that I learned about while I was doing that course, which I found out about at the beginning of 2008, which was called synthetic biology. And my collaborator and friend, Sasha Poflep, told me about this new thing where engineers were coming into biology and actually rethinking the ideology that was previously held in genetic engineering, which was more sort of tinkering, you could say. And instead, engineers were coming in with this control mindset and the idea that biology could be a material to program. This blew my mind. And that sort of started a 10-year journey into immersing myself in the field, really embedding myself at the highest level. So attending science conferences, working with some of the leaders in the field, and getting very sort of embedded in the politics of the creation of a new field of technoscience. And I went on to do a PhD to try and make sense of where that left me as a practitioner, because suddenly I was no longer making work that was critiquing and examining a field, but I was somehow promulgating it as well. And a lot of the questions that were raised for me was, why? Why are we doing this, or who's doing this, and who gets to decide? And my PhD was about this sort of promise that underlies a lot of design and engineering practice and technology practice, which is this ambition, this utopian ambition to make the world a better place. And I became very curious on what this better mean, and when certain people are making these promises, what do they mean by better, and how do they get to realize their particular visions? And after that, I went on to sort of re-establish my practice, but sort of reimagining myself perhaps more as an artist, because that felt like a lot of the conflict I was experiencing or the work that I was doing within the field often felt like a performance. It was, in a way, a form of performance art, standing up on stage at a scientific conference at the National Academies of Sciences in DC. I was sort of interfering, and that really set me up for what I've been doing the last 3, 4, 5 years, which is to looking more broadly at our relationship with nature and how technologies, not just synthetic biology, but also AI and other kinds of artificial life or simulations of life, or simulations as humans may understand them to be lifelike, start to blur or problematize this artificial idea of what nature is, and all of this, how it stops us being able to reconnect with the natural world, which is what we need to do in this terrible climate emergency. So my studio is me and often amazing teams of people for particular projects coming together with scientists and designers, computer programmers, computer scientists to try and make works that often simulate nature, but as a way to think about this relationship we have with nature.
So you've described, sort of 10 years ago learning about synthetic biology, and I think there's an interest over the last 10 years how the idea of programmable nature has become more widespread, but it's also, as those technologies have become more accessible or used in different ways. I don't know whether you want to just reflect for a little moment on that move from understanding nature as that which surrounds us to something that we can control and program at an individual level, at a societal level, at a governmental level, and maybe how that plays out in your work.
I think, it's a really complicated and packed question. It's sort of the root of it all. I think these ideas of controlling nature have been sort of bubbling up and very powerful since the beginning of the Enlightenment, and sort of the idea that knowledge could help us emancipate humans from the natural world as if it was somewhere to leave. And those ideas are reflected as far back as the Garden of Eden, the story of that it's something that you can be ejected from. The synthetic biology, the scientists and engineers I've worked with often use this description of 10,000 years of humans breeding crops and breeding animals as a way to not so much justify what they're doing, but to explain that it isn't different, that it's just an extension of a previous human intention to control and to make nature useful for us. So I wouldn't say that I think maybe a good way of describing it is an escalation, certainly since the sort of colonial and industrial eras. And what we're seeing now is just the rapid acceleration of both those actions and the effects of it. But
No, I think you're right. I think that escalation is something that also plays out in your work as the technologies have changed. You mentioned that you are increasingly using artificial intelligence and machine learning, which has also become slightly more widespread understood about the role it can play in programming.
And I think that what really disturbs me is this, increasingly is this paradox that we're faced with climate emergency. And this year, 2021, it seems ever more clear and even more accepted in politics and the media that this is happening finally, that there is a more widespread description of it happening, but no action. And we hope that COP may sort of change some of that, but I think there's generally a sense that it's too late. But underneath it all, the thing that disturbs me most is how we say that we know there's a problem, and yet we're investing so much in creating alternative lifelike forms. So our behaviors aren't changing, we're investing, and I say we very broadly, societies, technology companies, governments are investing in technologies that can simulate life or be lifelike, like AI, but we're not really doing anything about the other, the life that already exists. And it's that human created paradox. And in all of these things, I'm saying we humans very generally, and of course it's not it's certain groups and certain societies that are doing this.
But I think that's also where art comes in, isn't it? Because art is something that allows you to look at the world and understand it differently and see it differently and see our role in the world differently. And so probably we should start talking about art. And I think if we want to talk about your most recent project that's on the go at the minute, Pollinator, that's one where actually the role of the artist and the role of nature and the role of the machine are kind of potentially equal.
So, I think it's really nice that you see it that way, because that's what I'm trying to do, and also to play with this balance. So the Pollinator Commission is a new large-scale commission for the Eden Project, Cornwall. And it was originally a brief to create a sculpture about pollinators. So it's a larger program at Eden called Create a Buzz, which is funded by the Garfield Weston Foundation. And it's about bringing attention to the plight of pollinators in the UK. So most of us are aware of the dangers facing honeybees, but there are many other kinds of pollinators, from bees to wasps to moths to flies and more. And insect numbers are crashing around the world. And without pollinators, we can't survive. But when I was asked, to propose something for this amazing 55-meter outdoor plot at Eden, I thought, well, this is a missed opportunity to make something about pollinators, and rather let's make something for pollinators. So I proposed creating a garden using an algorithm, so essentially a sculpture for pollinators, and the algorithm would be designed to try and reduce human aesthetic biases. So rather than making something that looks like how we would like it to look, so subject to human taste, instead it would be designed for pollinators' taste, so accommodating the different needs of different pollinators. So different pollinators can see different colors to us and to each other, depending on which bits of the light spectrum they can see. Some pollinators, like bees, can memorize the locations of flowers that they visit, and they optimize those journey times. They may visit 10,000 flowers in a day. So finding the optimal mathematical solution to that is absolutely essential to kind of minimize fuel usage and increase forage, and others randomly sort of forage. So the algorithm is designed to accommodate all of that, to create maximum blooming over the whole year, range all the flowers and plants and grasses and things with seed heads over the winter, to create a garden that serves the greatest diversity of pollinators possible across the year. So I proposed that, and then I also said, well, let's put this algorithm online, and then anyone can create their own DIY edition of the artwork. They can play with the same tool, download a PDF which has their garden plan, and potentially plant it. And then we're going to create new large editions in other countries around the world, and creating each new edition garden involves creating a new plant list. So we have this interesting commissioning model that's also sort of spreading almost like a mycelial network, that you have new gardens popping up that then can seed new local DIY gardens, because if a sort of large institution can help us develop a new plant list, say in Germany, then users or visitors to that new garden may then be inspired to create their own garden. So the intention is really to challenge not just who an artwork is for, is it for us or is it for pollinators, but also to challenge some of these commissioning models. Who's the first? Who, in the art world, if a museum is commissioning a new work, they want to be the owner, the first, and take that priority. And instead, we have this sort of different kind of approach that we want everyone to be in this together, and adding more names to the lists becomes exciting and an opportunity to show how we can all come together in this challenge. I'm really excited to think about some of the stranger aspects of this as an artwork. And one of those is that it's leaky. So we have insects coming into the site and taking parts of the artwork away with them as they go to other plots and take the pollen that they've taken from our artwork to somewhere else. And it's also leaky because it's not in a gallery. It's in this other kind of space where different kinds of human visitors will experience it, but also different kinds of interactions happen between insects and plants primarily. So the human becomes a viewer, sort of a background viewer of the artwork, a background user in a way.
I mean, it's an incredibly complex work to think that you've designed the work for insects, for pollinators, and yet the work demands this artificial intelligence or machine learning algorithm to decide the best route for them. It's not something that they can do on their own. They do it on their own, but you're improving it for them.
It's one way I've been thinking about it is it's a very unnatural garden, because you would never see a lot of the plants we're using, or most of the plants are perennial garden plants, so things that are readily available but are known for their benefits to pollinators. And even pulling together that list is very difficult, because there isn't that much research. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence of plants for pollinators. So some of the things we'll be doing is actually doing monitoring to see if attracts more pollinators. But you have this sort of different way of super saturating the natural environment. So it's not like a meadow, it's the super intense agglomeration of flowers in one place, of all the colors, all the varieties. You know, it's not going to be a tasteful palette, it's like this, it's everything mixed together. And so it's an unnatural garden, but designed for nature. So that's...
Maybe you could talk about that in relation to a much earlier work that you did called Designing for the Sixth Extinction, and see if there's some link there around how you've started to translate these ideas of programming nature or systems biology to now get to this point with pollinator. Can you describe that work for us a little bit?
Yeah, so Designing for the Sixth Extinction was a piece that I made in 2013. And it was when I was really sort of teeth in to the synthetic biology community. And I attended this incredible conference, which was the first sort of official meeting of synthetic biologists and conservationists. And these are two groups that you wouldn't normally expect to find together. And it was co-organized by a really inspiring conservationist called Kent Redford, who has taken on this very interesting role of trying to build this relationship between the two fields. And traditionally, we would imagine genetic engineering sort of enthusiasts and conservationists as two very opposed groups. And instead, one of the questions that was being discussed, sort of the burgeoning question at this conference, was, could synthetic biology, rather than be a danger to conservation practice, you know, with things escaping, could actually help conservation? And that blew my mind, the idea that we could be potentially, some of the things that came up was sort of, designing organisms to support natural ones. And already you have this distinction being created. So could you engineer coral so it can withstand warmer waters is perhaps the most kind of easy to grasp sort of demonstration of that. Is it better to let the coral reefs die out, or should we have GMO coral, and at least the coral reefs are functioning? So if that's the case, I began to wonder, well, what do the wilds look like in this scenario? Because there's no true, you know, we think of nature, wilderness as this other, you know, is it that we'd rather let it just be destroyed rather than sort of infect it in some way? But of course, wilderness is unnatural because it's a human idea. And, you know, we've created wilderness parks, which themselves are managed, and it starts to get really messy and blurry. And that whole thing fascinated me. So I created this project that was sort of in response to these conversations as a way to understand my own questions, but also to reflect back to the synthetic biologists and conservationists, their discussion. So, and that was the way a lot of my work was kind of going at that time, was actually creating tools for discourse within the field. So I created this artwork, which is a vision of a perfectly sort of lush looking forest. And as it's a huge print, it looks like a window through the gallery wall. And as you look at it, you start to see some very unnatural, strange things lurking in the undergrowth. So one of the trees has this sort of bulbous balloon-like fungus on it, but it's transparent. And what that is actually described in an accompanying fictional patent application. So it's not described as a being, it's described as a device, and it's a device to pump serum into a tree that's suffering from an infection called sudden oak death. And then there's this sort of porcupine-like thing in the undergrowth, and that's a seed dispersing unit. So there's this terrible insidious problem called the silent forest, where we look at a forest and we think it looks wonderful, but actually all the mammals, birds have disappeared, and those are the vehicles for seed dispersal. Without them, you tend towards a monoculture. So having something to take the place, sort of following the ideas of rewilding, some kind of organism that could generically collect and disperse seeds, but is a biological mechanism, is one of the ideas I was playing with. And all of these synthetic organisms that I imagined are very fictional, but they're rooted in the real discussions. So I proposed that they would have an alternative DNA programming code, so like Windows versus Mac. So they would have 6-lettered DNA code rather than the 4 letters that we are made from, A, T, C, and G. And that is a real discussion happening still in synthetic biology about engineered release, that if things are operating on a different code, then they won't cause trouble. And whether that's the truth, or what is the truth here, if that's reliable, is up for debate and research. So it's a really problematic vision that I presented, but it looks beautiful, and then it's unsettling. And that was, in a way, the kind of precursor to 10 years of work that gets me to where I am now, which is kind of talking about how does technology intervene in the natural world.
I think that relationship between sort of the beautiful and the unsettling, and the desire to intervene, is there in a lot of your work, actually, and it follows through that in Pollinator you're intervening in the nice afternoon pastime of tending a flower garden, and you're intervening in the route that the pollinators fly as well. So I think that's the kind of two ways in which we could talk about it.
This may be the least beautiful project. So,
yeah.
Which is actually, and I mean that quite seriously, that a lot of the work that I have done, so the wilding of Mars, which was simulating creating a wilderness on Mars, but not for humans, by seeding plant life, but no human life, or resurrecting the sublime, which was a collaborative work where we brought back the smell of extinct flowers. But all of these projects, including Sixth Extinction, I purposefully used the aesthetic of the colonial representation. So the sublime landscape painting is a strong sort of template for the way I create imagery. And that's intentional because I'm playing with recognized aesthetic paradigms, like, well, it's set up like a landscape painting, and it's, using the golden section, so it's got this familiarity to the way it's set up. And so, for the Western art viewer, it's an accepted sort of attitude. We're like, oh, I feel comfortable with this, and then it's when you start to look closer, there's something that's off. So I'm playing with that as a way to get into to get to the next layer, in a way. It's like, well, when you start to look closer, there's something that's not quite right. And with the Pollinator Commission, whose name I can't quite reveal yet, it's using this idea of the garden, but making it hopefully quite outrageous. So that the traditional English gardener, faced with the prospect of planting one of these, may think, well, this is not how I would do it, but can the value of the artwork persuade someone to take the leap?
So I think this connects also to this more commonly held idea of rewilding. The fact that we've been encouraged to let our lawns go to meadows, and to consider changing the urban and the built environment. As you said, you sort of studied architecture. And how does rewilding connect to ideas of sort of species or habitat loss in your work? Because I know you have a project called The Substitute, which looks a little bit at this. Can you tell us a bit about The Substitute?
The idea of rewilding in itself is incredibly fascinating, because it's, in a way, possibly the best method that we have, because the natural world is not in stasis. So in conservation, the idea is preservation, or trying to reconstruct an environment, but biology and evolution don't stand still. So if you want to reintroduce something, that environment may actually have changed. So with habitat loss, you can put the mammoth back into the landscape, but what does it eat? Is it about reconstructing that landscape so that it can suit the mammoth? Or, as the case may be, this idea that we could de-extinct a mammoth is actually to bring back a hairy elephant, sort of a mammoth-like creature, so that, and some of the more extreme dreams for this very real project that's going on is to reintroduce this sort of mammoth-like elephant into the Siberian steppe to help reconstruct those grassy landscapes, because you need this big mowing, pooping machine. So rewilding follows that idea that there's keystone species like beavers in the UK that can be reintroduced to actually reconstruct habitats, but you could also put in something similar. It doesn't need to be the same thing, but something that can perform the same function as a keystone species. So something that will do something that everything else can reconstruct, but it's never necessarily going back to how it was. So The Substitute is a work that I created a couple of years ago, which started in 2018, I think, yeah, 2018, when I read the news of Sudan, the northern white rhino, of his passing. And I had no idea that there was only one male northern white rhino left. You know, in my mind, it's probably in many of our minds, like, oh, rhinos are in trouble. But then suddenly, you know, top of the news feed is, you know, Sudan is dead. There's only 2 females left. The northern white rhino subspecies is, you know, effectively extinct. But don't worry, because they're harvesting, or they want to harvest eggs from the last 2 females, and we might be able to de-extinct them. And there's another version of this, which is happening at UCSD, the University of California, San Diego, another project where they've taken cells to create stem cells. And the idea is perhaps we could resurrect Sudan or a northern white rhino using these stem cells. But, and, you know, having talked with the scientists at UCSD, wonderful man called Oliver Ryder, you know, you have these beating myocardial stem cells, but how do you turn that into a rhino? That step is missing. And should you even do that? Because is that northern white rhino that could be recreated, is it a northern white rhino? Is it just a technological substitute? Because, for example, and I'm sure this is the same with every organism, a northern white rhino is not just its DNA, it is its social behavior, and you know, much more so with something like a northern white rhino than a bacteria, perhaps, because a northern white rhino has vocalizations. They were perhaps the most vocal of all the rhino subspecies. So particular cultural things that may not necessarily be genetically handed down, but are learnt socially. So if there's no group for it to learn from, what would it be? So the idea with the IVF approach is to actually use a southern white rhino as a surrogate. So the very dangerous act of taking the eggs from the last 2 female northern white rhinos, using Sudan or other males' sperm to fertilize them, and then having the surrogate. But if you're the only northern white rhino in a group of southern white rhinos, are you a northern white rhino? So the work kind of carries on from this idea of creating a substitute that's not a true version of the original. The second thread in the work was this paper by DeepMind, and they are an AI company, and it came out about the same time as Sudan's passing. And they'd done this piece of work with an artificial agent, which is essentially a dot. And this agent had been released into a virtual space, and the idea was that it would learn to map its space, and it solved it in the same way as the mammalian brain has evolved to solve that, with this sort of grid cell-like mapping. And that is a very obscure scientific experiment, but sort of really raises this paradox of why are we investing so much in this artificial agent finding its way around a box when we are completely failing to protect these extraordinary, living, highly intelligent creatures. And I wanted to bring that into the piece as well. So the substitute sort of follows the iconography of the Dürer, the famous Dürer print of 1515 of this rhinoceros in a box. And in Dürer's case, it was an Indian rhino, and he copied it badly. So he only heard reports of what this rhino looked like, and he put an extra horn on its back. And that image was replicated through the Enlightenment as the standard for a rhino, until it was corrected later on. So my rhino, and I say my because, you know, he's my replica of what the northern white rhino is, wanders around in a box and constitutes before our eyes, and he's incredibly lifelike. So I worked with some exceptional animators from the mill to do this, and he follows the route of the DeepMind experiment and comes to life over a couple of minutes, to the point where he's staring you right in the face. The sounds are taken from field recordings of northern white rhinos, and then he disappears. And he does this over and over again. And he's living in complete isolation in this white box as this perfect seeming replica. And in the gallery, he's life-size, so 2 meters tall, looking at you eye to eye, and you become the subject in a way. He's looking at you. And then he goes, and he though it's a completely imperfect replica because he's made of archival sounds. He's a Hollywood 3D model that was originally a southern white rhino from an energy drink commercial in South America and has been repurposed and rebuilt to be a northern white rhino. So he's a very bad replica, but is he the best replica that we have or that we deserve? And that's sort of some of the unsettling feelings I'm trying to raise in the work. And it's both joyous and incredibly sad. You know, you have this moment that you would never even get at a zoo to be so close to the rhino, but he then disappears.
So I've been traveling around, as you know, a little bit over the summer, and re-encountering some of your works that I've seen before and know before in different gallery spaces. And yes, it is remarkable when you come into a gallery and are confronted with a life-size rhino projected onto the wall, and see him pacing about. And it's also remarkable to go into a gallery and smell an extinct flower. And so I can see how your work does take all of these forms, as you say, adopting some of the tropes and aesthetics recognizable from a history of art or from a history of early scientific illustration. And so I guess, what do you want to say about sort of the progress of art in engaging in these scientific disciplines? Do you think your way of looking at things or your way of displaying some of these ideas then challenges the modes of representation that the scientific communities are used to using?
That's really interesting. So I think in the scientific domain, yes, like that was a lot of what I was trying to do working with synthetic biologists, was to bring in to use these works as vehicles for discussion, and in a way that feeds back into the work. And using it, you know, the work, as I mentioned kind of earlier, was almost like a performance. that the being there and talking about this and raising these questions, but through these images or pieces, was a way to have difficult conversations or open up conversation with the people creating this kind of technological innovation. I think the pieces like The Substitute and Resurrecting the Sublime, and a lot of them have been, you know, purposefully using this colonial imagery, trying to understand the construction of Western science and the construction of the colonial mindsets and this particular gaze. And in a way, with the Pollinator Commission, I'm trying to step out of that and sort of test it from the other side. But the sort of, what is the impact of these works? And that's maybe because of my design and architecture training that became increasingly concerned, and also my own panic with the climate crisis, is what can I do? What are we doing? I can create these pieces that create a sense of loss or wonder in the gallery, but then what happens next? And that sort of left me feeling that I wanted to try something different, which is what really inspired this Pollinator sort of commission experiment. Was, can art be useful? Should it be useful? Should it be, you know, is that wrong? Am I just doing design? But in the other side, well, why can't, you know, I think that the Serpentine Back to Earth project that they're doing, this curatorial project where they're asking artists to create campaigns, is extremely interesting, because you start to question, well, what is a campaign, an environmental campaign by an artist, and what is the point? So with the Pollinator Commission, we're not going to save pollinators. Maybe, who knows how many people will plant a garden, but creating the sense of agency or control. So not so much control that we can redesign nature, but a sense in the face of impending panic and doom that there is stuff that we can do. It's not recycling, and feeling that our own part is not good enough or it's our fault, but that you can changing our perspective on the landscape, looking at landscape through the perspective of other organisms, like creating a way to help people see that, could be empowering. Beyond just experiencing the work in the gallery, where what do you do next? You go and donate to save the rhino. What can you do about the rhino?
I think that's really important. It's something I'm very interested in, the way art and activism overlaps, and particularly in the area of technology, sometimes just bringing attention to the way in which we use technology is enough of an activist gesture. And artists often take technologies and make them do things they weren't supposed to or weren't designed for. And just by doing that, they bring attention to the possibility of intervening in the relationship between the human and the technological world. And you're just adding an extra layer to that by also showing how you can use technology to intervene in the natural world or to bring attention to issues where technology has negatively affected the natural world.
That's really nice that you see that. I think with this, I was like, how can a digital artwork not end up as an NFT? Like, how can a digital artwork be something that doesn't live on a screen? So we're printing a digital artwork in plants, and it's not just a one-off installation, it's a 5-year commitment to Eden. And I love that. Like, I'm so excited by that this thing is not in a gallery for 3 months, that it's going to be 5 years of it growing and dying and needing to be cared for and tended. And it's a really different outcome for a digital artwork. So
I think that's perfectly fitting, because at the Digital Departures Lab, we're always looking for new ways to think about the digital. We're thinking about ways to depart from the digital. So not making non-fungible tokens is a good departure from the digital by our point of view. And we're looking forward to talking to you again in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time to see how the garden's grown, and to see what's happening with the Eden project in general and its move to Scotland also. So
let's make more gardens.
Exactly. Thanks very much, Daisy. It's been wonderful to talk to you this morning.
You too. Thank you.